Hello and welcome to Time for God from St. Peter's, Bexhill. Today we are thinking about Mark chapter 8 verses 1 to 38 when Jesus predicts his death. And we have reached the halfway point of Mark's Gospel. The first half is packed full of healing miracles and stories, all leading to questions about who Jesus is. And they reach their climax, either side of today's reading. In the passage just before, Peter says to Jesus, "You are the Christ." Immediately afterwards, we have the Transfiguration. Between these two amazing events, Jesus maps out the way ahead. He outlines what it means for him to be the Christ and for us to follow. Today's story takes place in Caesarea Philippi at the rocky base of Mount Hermon. There's a picture of it on the sheet. The town had previously been called Paneas, but had been rebuilt and renamed in Jesus' time by the ruler of the area, Philip. It contained the shrine of the pagan god Pan, standing in front of what was considered to be the gateway to hell. The location is significant. Later Christian traditions sometimes identified Pan with the devil and linked Christ's coming with Pan's destruction. I think some of our images of the devil come from images of Pan, and his name is probably the source of our word panic. Pan was said by the writer Plutarch to be the only god who actually died, which made his shrine a fitting place for this conversation to take place. You may remember last week we thought about the devil testing Jesus in the wilderness in Mark chapter 1, 9 to 13. The Bible builds up a picture of the devil as the source of opposition to God's purposes and resentment at God's delight in humanity. Now Jesus recognizes the devil at work again with his cry of, "Get behind me, Satan." But this time it is in his friend, as Peter tries to deflect him from his chosen path of faithfulness. Last week, Jesus encountered the devil in the desert. Here we find the more common experience, encountering him among friends. If we ever feel betrayed or deserted by our friends and families when we need them most, then we have begun to have some idea of how Jesus must have felt. Peter's reaction to Jesus saying that he, Jesus, will die hints at so much of what lies ahead. It prefigures the betrayal, denial, and desertion of Jesus by his other disciples as well. But you can see why Peter is so concerned. Jesus is not just talking about his death, but death on a cross, crucifixion. Crucifixion was the Roman punishment of the worst offenders and was designed to be painful, slow, and humiliating. It was a terrible fate for anyone, let alone a political or religious leader. It would also be deeply shameful to a Jew, stripped naked, nailed to a tree. But Jesus warns his disciples that this is what is coming. And when he returns in glory, he will be ashamed of anyone who has been ashamed of him. I feel he must have been looking at Peter when he said this. When Jesus appointed the 12 disciples, he gave the fisherman Simon a new name, Peter. Peter means rock, yet it is a rather ambivalent nickname. Much later on, Peter will be strong, but right now he is more rocky than a rock. It seems extraordinary that Peter states that Jesus is God's Christ in one breath, yet in virtually the next takes him aside to put him right about what this means. His reaction is to do with his idea of what he expects Jesus to do and be. His idea is wrong. Nevertheless, by being open, their relationship survives this rockiness of mutual rebuking. Peter will continue to have a rocky journey following Jesus to the cross, but will eventually learn that God fulfills the promise inherent in Jesus' choice of his new name. But even after the resurrection, Peter's life is not easy. Some preachers will tell you that the Christian life is one of unremitting blessing. Pray and everything will be all right, they say. You will succeed. This is sometimes called prosperity theology, and they are wrong. If we truly follow and stand up for Christ, we will know rebuke as well as blessing. Just read the Bible and look at the stories of the disciples. Nowhere does it promise that following Jesus will lead to an easy life, but it will be the right life and will lead to everlasting life. This is what matters. After all, Peter, like most others of his time, was expecting a warrior Messiah who would expel the occupying Romans and establish a peaceful homeland by force. This is not the way of Jesus. It is so easy to expect Jesus to conform to our image of God. The temptation is to focus on our human ambition, human safety, and human comfort, and project these onto Jesus, rather than finding out what he wants of us. Jesus calls us to put our expectations aside and simply follow. This is the adventure. But as we have seen, even among Jesus' closest friends, that didn't always happen. We can read today's event as reversing the story of Adam and Eve back in Genesis chapter 3. Then they succumbed to the serpent's temptation to disobey God, which led to recriminations and fractured relationships as Adam and Eve blamed each other for what went wrong. Today, Jesus' obedience establishes a new community as he invites others to follow his generous way of self-giving and love. Despite his rebuke, Peter and Jesus' relationship is unbroken, and 6 days later, Peter is included in Jesus' transfiguration, helping him to see that the way of the cross is indeed the path to glory. We still live in a fractured world, which means that we all have to cope with disagreements at some time or other. For lots of reasons, each of us behaves differently. So how do you react to argument? Are you prickly like a porcupine and shoot off at random? Or feisty like a fox and enjoy the argument? Or do you become silent like a tortoise and hide in your shell? You don't need to answer, but we do all need to work out the way that, as Christians, we should at least try to respond. Jesus and Peter are an example of how open disagreements can lead to a place of learning and understanding one another. Jesus is teaching the disciples that the kind of Messiah they have in mind isn't right. Jesus wants to show them that he's going to appear to do the opposite of what they expect. He will be rejected, suffer, and die. This is the way of the cross, the way of love. And love always wins in the end. If we are to grow as people of faith, we need to be able to create an environment where we feel safe enough to disagree, knowing that we will not be rejected. Can we do that? Jesus seems to have created an atmosphere where his friends weren't afraid to speak out. Peter is quite confident in his contradiction, and Jesus is comfortable to disagree with Peter, very strongly indeed, as it turns out. But is Peter kicked out of the group? Is Peter rejected? Far from it. It is nearly a year since we first closed the church and started putting services online. In that year, the world has changed in ways we could not have predicted, but it is still calling out for meaning and purpose, as much now as ever before. As we move through Lent and the world gradually starts to open up again, we can reflect on the way ahead for our church in this land and at this time. And we all have a role to play. For whatever our age or situation, what lies ahead with God is always far greater than what lies behind. This is true not only of individuals, but of churches as well. We can never say that our best days are behind us. God has no compulsory retirement age, and the future is bright. And if God still has work for us, he will supply the resources to do it, while also expecting us to make an effort ourselves. I'd like to finish with this painting. It's called The Yellow Christ, painted by Paul Gogar in 1889. Gogar was a troubled man who struggled with his faith, but here he makes a bold, confident and symbolic statement. He shows Jesus on the cross in a humble scene near where he lived in Brittany at the time. Women gather around the cross in their traditional dress, while a man climbs over the wall in the middle distance. Is he coming or going? It's not clear. But what is clear is that the figures form a circle around Jesus. They form a community of their time and their place. But the circle is not complete. The circle is never complete. There is always room for one more, for each one of us to enter the story and sit at the foot of the cross ourselves and invite others to do the same. Amen.